the international economic policy announced, and then the intellectual foundations of the new vision were explained by the National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake. That was all in a couple of days of late September. The intervention panel concluded that from now on we would not, it said in effect that the age of altruism is over. So we're not going to be nice guys anymore in intervention. I don't have to waste time on describing what happened when we were nice guys. Anyway, that's over. Now intervention is to be guided by the principle, what's in it for us? Okay? Those were the words, in fact, that the New York Times highlighted in describing the panel. So no more nice guy. From now on, it's what's in it for us. That's the intervention panel. The economic panel, the export strategy that was announced, stated, well, I mean, it was sort of encapsulated rather nicely by the Secretary of Treasury, Lloyd Benson, who said, I'm tired of this level playing field business. From now on, we're going to have the playing field tilted in favor of American business. Okay, so the Reagan administration was breaking records, actually, in violating free trade agreements, like so-called free trade agreements like GATT, and then introducing protection. They, in fact, approximately doubled the percentage of imports subject to one or another form of protection. James Baker, when he was Secretary of Treasury, proudly announced to the business community that the Reagan administration had been more protectionist, had been more radical in violating market principles than all post-war administrations combined, which was quite true. It's left to the intellectuals to produce odes to our devotion to the free market. This is important stuff, no time for that. But the Clinton panel announced that that wasn't enough. They were going to go beyond the sporadic and sort of random violations of GATT and other agreements by the Reaganites, and they were going to do it in a more systematic way with huge export-import bank loans to force other countries to purchase U.S. exports and other such measures, which are recognized to be in violation of GATT and to be market distorting, but, you know, we've got to tilt the playing field even more in favor of U.S. corporations than before. Well, that was the second element of the new strategy. And the third element, Anthony Lake said that we're going to go from containment to enlargement. In the past, we had been containing threats to democracies, as, for example, in Iran and Guatemala and Dominican Republic and Chile, and you can go on and add the rest, you're readers of this journal, and on through the 80s. So that's when we were containing threats to democracy. And now we're going to enlarge what we've been doing before. And all of this was parroted without question by what must be the most servile intellectual class in the world. Raised no question about how we'd been containing threats to democracy. For example, when we overthrew the parliamentary government of Brazil and installed a bunch of neo-fascist monsters and on and on. Well, anyhow, we're going to enlarge what we've been doing in the past, not be limited to what we have succeeded in doing. So there are a lot of ways that you could proceed. For example, there's about 500,000 children a year who die from the costs of debt reduction. And we should be able to do better than that. After all, 500,000 a year isn't a very large number. So maybe we can enlarge what we've been doing in the past. There are 11 million who die a year in the third world because they have been left by Western colonialism in a state of disaster and despair, and the West has been tightening the noose ever since and won't give a few pennies of aid that might be enough to save children dying from diarrhea and so on. And 11 million children, again, is not a huge number. I mean, after all, population's a big problem. So maybe we can do something about that. We can get it a little better. In the last 30 years, the gap between the richest and the poorest countries has doubled. Back around 1960, it was about 30 to 1, the 20% richest and 20% poorest. The gap was about 30 to 1. It's gone up to about 60 to 1. Thanks to a combination of protectionist policies in the rich countries, which have become much more protectionist in recent years, and liberalization for the poor countries, which has, the effects of imposing market discipline, highly destructive. Those figures themselves, however, are highly misleading, because if you take the same UN figures and you look at the top 20% of people, not countries, but the top 20% of people in wealth and the bottom 20% in wealth, the gap has in fact extended to 140 to 1. So it's far greater than the gap between the richer nations and the poorer nations, which means the gaps are primarily, about half of them are internal to each society. These are the polarizing tendencies that we have been witnessing here as well, and which are highly praised by the business press. So, for example, the Wall Street Journal had a very enthusiastic article about a month ago describing what they called a welcome development of transcendent importance. Namely, wages in the United States had sunk to below any industrial country except for England, which had done even better in beating down the working class and the poor. We hadn't yet made it to South Korea and Taiwan, and Papua New Guinea was still a couple of steps beyond. But that's another way in which we can enlarge the vision as we proceed into the future, and new policies are in fact designed for that. It's now reached a point, I mean, these have a lowering effect on everyone, notice, in an era where productive labor can be transferred to high repression, low wage areas very easily, in an era of internationalization of production and finance. It's very easy, the lowering of wages in one place has an automatic effect of lowering them everywhere. So lowering Mexican wages will lower U.S. wages, lowering U.S. wages, lowering German wages.
It's very easy to be overwhelmed by everything that you presented to us tonight. What can individuals do to help promote change here in the United States and abroad?
Well, alone they really can't do anything very much, which is exactly why every social change in history and every advance in history, and there are plenty of them, has come from concerted, organized public action. That's why we don't live under feudalism. That's why we don't have slavery. That's why we've achieved a certain level of civil rights. That's why women's issues got onto the agenda in the last years. That's why questions about the environment, meaning the possibility that our children or their children may have a world to live in, became issues. It was never given by a gift from above. It was always given by struggle. Sometimes the struggle's achieved, sometimes they're beaten back. I mean, take, say, labor struggles in the United States. The unions have typically been, in many countries, one of the dominant, if not the dominant, agency of progressive social change, of improving the welfare of the general population. The United States is a business-run society to an unusual extent. That's why we are off the spectrum on things like health care and so on. It also happens to have an unusually violent labor history. U.S. workers didn't get the rights that were pretty standard in Europe until the 1930s, about 50 years afterwards, after a very violent and brutal struggle, I should say, with hundreds of workers killed by security forces and so on. So then they finally got, say, the right to organize and the 40-hour week. Those rights were quickly lost. There was a tremendous business offensive to try to beat back those gains. Business was terrified by them. You read the business press in the 30s after the right to organize was finally won, and there's talk about how the rising political power of the masses is the greatest hazard facing industrialists, and unless their thinking is redirected, we're going to face disaster. The kind of vulgar Marxist rhetoric is normal for business publications, I should say. The values are opposite, but the beliefs are the same about how the world works. And immediately after the Second World War, those victories were beaten back. The 40-hour week is a thing of the past. The right to organize is a thing of the past. I think I broke this or something. Okay, thanks. Unions are declining, and with them, one of the means by which people can participate in a meaningful way in changing their lives. The hysteria about the effort of working people through their organizations to enter the political arena shows you just how much is at stake. But it also answers your question. What you should do is exactly the kinds of things that are going to lead to hysteria among privileged and powerful people. And they indicate very clearly what those things are, and just follow the lead.
Professor Chomsky, I'd like you to go beyond the next vision thing, the healthcare thing, and go to welfare reform and talk about what we can expect in terms of welfare reform.
Well, first of all, when you talk about welfare, we ought to be a little honest about it. What's called welfare is public programs that provide funds for poor people. That's called welfare. Public programs that provide funds for rich people are not called welfare. But in fact, that's what most of the public funds are. So for example, now the way it's done, it's like, aid for mothers with dependent children, that you see. I mean, you don't see much, but, a few pennies go that way. You don't see fiscal policies which amount to exactly the same thing. So like tax benefits. Tax benefits on, say, home mortgages are a welfare payment, right? They're equivalent, identical to a welfare payment. If you pay less for your mortgage, that's the same as if some public fund gave you more. It's identical. And in fact, if you look at the welfare benefits that are disguised by fiscal measures, like real estate taxes and corporate prerogatives that are untaxed and so on, it's enormous. They almost all go to the most wealthy sector, and I don't think anybody's, this is not the kind of thing that people study much, but the few attempts that have been made to evaluate it indicate that they probably exceed all of so-called welfare. And that's only the beginning. What about the Boeing Corporation again? These models for the future. Well, that's a huge welfare program. The payments, the taxes that your taxes that go to the Pentagon and NASA and DOE and the rest of them, that's an enormous welfare program, most of which gets funneled quite directly to advanced sectors of industry and to their investors and their owners. And the top managerial levels, and some of it trickles down to parts of the workforce. But primarily, if you look at the distribution of funds, it's a tremendous welfare program for the rich. The same with Export-Import Bank loans. That's your taxes, remember. And they're going to compel foreign countries to purchase exports from U.S.-based manufacturers who, for all you know, may be producing abroad, maybe having their production done abroad because they're multinationals. Well, you try to add up all this stuff. There are enormous welfare programs which go primarily to the wealthy and the powerful. And that's not a big surprise, after all. I mean, they, after all, run the state apparatus. Why be surprised if they design it in their interests? This is a truism that goes back to people like Adam Smith, in fact. It's obvious. So when you talk about welfare reform, remember what's being discussed under that rubric is a little tiny fraction of it, namely the part that helps some poor people. Well, how should that be reformed? In my opinion, it should be reformed by enormously expanding it and cutting back on the welfare to the rich. But those are topics that are not going to be on the agenda. The welfare programs for the rich are not going to be on the agenda unless people like you put them there. Then they can be on the agenda. Like voting rights for black people were put on the agenda by struggle, not because somebody decided to give a gift, and so on for everything else. Yeah. I can't see it too well. Yeah.
Okay. In the past, you took a very principled and controversial stand with regard to Cambodia, and without siding with Pol Pot, you did a lot of exposure of the lies and maneuvering of the imperialists that were, operating in that situation. And I would have hoped that you would apply that same approach to what's happening in Peru today.
In Peru?
Yeah. And that where there are workers together with peasants fighting not just for workers' rights within the existing system, but for what Marx talked about as the fundamental right, and that's the workers' right to run the state. And I think that, there's some very vicious lies and disinformation campaigns that have been launched by the Peruvian government and by the U.S. standing behind them and calling the shots. And also new standards being set around, abuses of human rights with regard to political prisoners that are having wide-ranging effects. Will you do more to expose these things?
Well, it's perfectly true that I don't know how well you could hear, but in Peru, I mean, I'll put it in my terms, which may not be the terms